Henry Walker had not answered his daughter's calls in months. He was ready to sell the house, pack away his wife's memory, and disappear into silence. But one freezing morning, a muddy German Shepherd puppy arrived at his door carrying a name from his past. Molly. The dog he once rescued had vanished while pregnant. Now, her only surviving pup had come back, with one last mission. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments below, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Cold rain blurred the Blue Ridge pines outside Boone, North Carolina, turning the early winter morning into a gray veil of mist, wet leaves, and silence. Henry Walker stood in the living room with a roll of packing tape in one hand and a photograph in the other. At 73, he was still a large man, though age had carved its tacks into him with quiet patience. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with a square jaw, deep-set gray eyes, and a short white beard that made him look sterner than he truly was. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles, hands that had once held rifles in dark places and wounded men in louder ones. For 30 years, the Navy had taught him how to enter danger without shaking. Grief, however, had proven to be a different kind of battlefield. The photograph showed his late wife, Margaret, sitting on the front steps in summer light, one hand lifted as if she were scolding him for taking the picture. Margaret Walker had been small and graceful, with soft brown eyes, silver blonde hair usually pinned at the back of her head, and a smile that made strangers feel as if they had been expected for dinner. Illness had thinned her before the end, but it had never managed to make her bitter. Even when pain bent her body, she still thanked nurses by name and worried whether Henry had eaten. That was the kind of woman she had been. A candle in a storm, stubborn enough to keep burning. Now her sweaters were folded in a cardboard box. Her gardening gloves lay beside old Christmas cards. Her favorite blue mug sat wrapped in newspaper on the dining table, as if it were something fragile enough to break from memory alone. Henry had told himself selling the house was practical. Too many rooms, too much land, too many echoes, but every box felt less like moving and more like betrayal. He pressed the tape across one box and stopped when he heard a faint sound from the porch. Scratch. Henry turned his head. The house settled around him with its usual old bone creaks. Rain tapped against the windows. He waited. Scratch, scratch. He frowned and walked toward the front door. The porch sometimes caught fallen branches when the wind came down from the ridge, but this sound was too careful, too small, almost polite. Henry opened the door. A German Shepherd puppy sat on the porch. For a moment, neither moved. The puppy looked about 5 or 6 months old, though hunger made her seem smaller. Mud clung to her black and tan coat in dark patches. Her paws were scraped raw at the edges, and one ear had a small tear near the tip. Rain had flattened the fur along her back, making her look thinner than any young dog had a right to look. Yet she did not bark. She did not whine. She did not lower herself in fear or leap toward him for comfort. She simply sat there, soaked and trembling, staring at Henry with eyes far too steady for a lost animal. "Well," Henry muttered, because old soldiers often spoke to strange problems before admitting they had one, "you picked a miserable morning for a visit." The puppy blinked once. Henry looked past her into the rain. No truck in the drive. No footprints except the muddy little marks leading up the porch steps. No person calling from the road. Just the trees, the fog, and that gray North Carolina cold that slipped through coats like a thief. "You alone?" he asked. The puppy kept looking at him. Something tightened in Henry's chest. He had known military working dogs that could stare through a man's excuses better than any chaplain. This puppy had that same unsettling stillness, as if she had not come to be rescued by anyone. She had come to be found by him. Against his better judgment, Henry stepped aside. "Come on, then, before we both freeze arguing about it." The puppy rose slowly. Her legs wobbled, but she crossed the threshold without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for permission rather than kindness. Inside, Henry laid an old towel near the door and brought water in a metal bowl. The puppy drank so fast he had to refill it twice. Then he found leftover chicken, tore it into small pieces, and watched her eat with desperate focus. Even starving, she did not growl or guard the food. She only paused between bites to glance toward the front windows. Henry noticed. After she finished, he expected her to collapse beside the fireplace. Any sensible creature would have. Instead, she walked to the north-facing window and stood there, nose close to the glass, staring toward the dark outline of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Henry leaned against the kitchen counter. "You planning to tell me what's out there?" The puppy did not turn. Hours passed. Rain thickened. Henry tried to return to his boxes, but the house had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It had a pulse now, 4 paws on hardwood, a small body moving from window to window, always returning to the north. Once Henry caught himself almost calling Margaret to come see. The thought struck so suddenly that he gripped the table until his fingers hurt. By evening, he spread a blanket beside the hearth. The puppy sniffed it politely, circled once, then left it and returned to the window. Henry sighed. Stubborn little thing. When she lowered her head, something flashed beneath the wet fur at her neck. Henry knelt slowly. There was a worn leather collar half hidden there, far too old for the puppy. A small metal tag hung from it, scratched and darkened with age. Henry turned it over. The letters were faint but still readable. Molly. The room seemed to lose its air. Henry stared at the name as rain whispered against the windows. Molly was not just a name. Molly was a German shepherd he had pulled from a snowbank less than a year earlier, pregnant, wounded, and nearly frozen to death. Molly was the dog Margaret had wrapped in warm towels with shaking hands. Molly was the mother-to-be who had vanished one winter night before her puppies were ever born. And now, somehow, one of those puppies had come to his door. Henry Walker did not move for a long time. The metal tag lay in his palm, cold from the puppy's damp fur, its scratched letters catching the weak lamplight beside the north window. Molly. The name did not arrive like a memory at first. It arrived like a hand on his chest, firm enough to stop his breathing. The young German shepherd stood only a few feet away, still facing the dark line of the Blue Ridge Mountains beyond the glass. She had eaten. She had drunk enough water to fill her hollow belly. Yet she had not settled. She waited with the patience of something sent, not something lost. Henry looked from the tag to the puppy's face, to the torn ear, to the eyes that were too steady, too familiar. He had seen that kind of gaze before on a night when the world had turned white and mean. It had been less than a year earlier, deep in the previous winter, on a mountain road north of Boone. Snow had not fallen that night so much as a tact. It came sideways across the windshield of Henry's old pickup, thick and furious, swallowing the yellow lines and turning every pine tree into a ghost. Henry had been driving home from a late appointment at the clinic where Margaret received treatment. He had gone alone because Margaret had been too weak that day, and because Henry had always been too proud to admit how much he hated sitting in hospital waiting rooms without her voice beside him. Margaret Walker was still alive then. She was 69, small-boned and elegant even in sickness, with silver blonde hair that she brushed carefully every morning no matter how tired she felt, soft brown eyes that noticed pain in others before her own, and hands that had spent a lifetime making broken things feel welcome. Cancer had thinned her face and slowed her steps, but it had not taken the kindness from her. That was the cruel thing about watching someone good suffer. The body became smaller, while the spirit remained impossibly large. Henry had been thinking of her when his headlights caught movement near the ditch. At first, he thought it was a torn tarp lifting in the wind. Then the shape struggled, rose halfway, and collapsed again. Henry braked hard. The pickup slid before the tires found gravel beneath the ice. He grabbed a flashlight, stepped into the storm, and heard a low warning growl beneath the wind. There, half buried in snow, lay a German shepherd female. She was black and tan beneath the white crust of ice, larger than she looked at first because her body was curled protectively around her swollen belly. She was pregnant, visibly so, her ribs moving too fast under a coat matted with frost. One rear leg bent at an unnatural angle, not broken perhaps, but badly strained or cut. Her eyes were amber-brown, bright with terror and exhaustion. When Henry came closer, she showed her teeth, not with hatred, but with the old sacred fear of a mother who had nothing left except the child inside her. "Easy, girl," Henry had said, lowering himself into the snow. His knees complained. His hands went numb almost immediately. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog growled again, but weaker. Henry had handled military working dogs into places where fear had a smell and loyalty could save a man's life. He knew the difference between aggression and desperation. This dog did not want to fight. She wanted the world to stop coming closer. So Henry removed one glove, held his bare hand out, and let the snow punish him for the gesture. The dog sniffed the air. For nearly a full minute they remained that way. An old warrior kneeling in a storm, a pregnant mother deciding whether one more human could be trusted. Finally, her head lowered. Henry wrapped her in the emergency blanket from his truck and lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been. That frightened him more than the growl had. When Henry carried her through the front door, Margaret was waiting in her robe, one hand braced against the hallway wall. She should have been in bed. Her skin looked pale, almost translucent, and the blue veins at her wrists showed beneath the lamplight, but her eyes sharpened the moment she saw the animal. "Henry Walker," she whispered. "Tell me you did not bring home a pregnant dog in a blizzard. She was in a ditch. That was not a denial. She needed help." Margaret looked at the shivering shepherd, then at the snow melting off Henry's coat, and for the first time that week, she smiled. "Then stop standing there like a guilty schoolboy and bring her to the laundry room." That was Margaret, weak enough to need help crossing the hall, stubborn enough to command the house like a queen receiving wounded soldiers. She warmed towels in the dryer, set a bowl of water near the dog's head, and made Henry call the emergency vet line while she spoke softly to the shepherd. They learned little that night except that the dog had no microchip, no visible owner tag, and enough willpower to outstare both of them. Margaret named her Molly before midnight. She said a mother deserved a soft name before her babies came into the world. For the next few weeks, Molly became part of the rhythm of the house, not the center of it. Margaret was still the heart of that home, as she had always been. But Molly brought a new kind of quiet purpose to the rooms. Margaret prepared a corner near the back den with clean blankets, warm towels, and an old quilt she claimed was too faded for guests, but perfect for puppies. Henry pretended to object to the dog hair. Margaret pretended to believe him. On better mornings, she sat in her chair with a cup of tea cooling beside her while Molly rested at her feet, swollen belly rising and falling. On bad afternoons, after treatment left Margaret gray with nausea, Molly would drag herself closer and place her head near Margaret's fingers. She never climbed onto the furniture. She never begged. She simply stayed, like a guard at the gate of a fading kingdom. One evening, Margaret folded a small, cream-colored blanket and laid it in the den. Henry remembered it clearly because her hands shook while she worked, though she tried to hide it. "If there's a runt," she said, "we're naming it Hope." Henry had looked up from the fireplace. "You've already decided we're keeping one?" "I've decided every house should have hope in it." He wanted to make a joke, something dry, something old, married, and safe, but the words caught behind his teeth because Margaret's voice had turned too gentle, as if she were speaking about more than puppies, so he only nodded. Hope, then. 2 nights later, the snow stopped. That was what haunted Henry most. Not the storm, but the quiet afterward. He woke before dawn with the old instinct that something in the house had shifted. The back den was empty. The quilt was cold. The laundry room door, the one Henry had checked twice before bed, stood cracked open. Molly was gone. Still pregnant, still limping, gone into a world of snow and black trees. Henry searched until his lungs burned. He followed faint tracks toward the ridge, but fresh powder began falling before noon, soft as ash and just as merciless. It erased everything. He drove back roads, knocked on farmhouse doors, called the county shelter, spoke with 2 deputies, and walked until his bad knee swelled against his jeans. For 3 days, he searched. On the 4th, Margaret's fever spiked. The doctor told him to bring her in immediately. Henry stood in the kitchen with his boots still wet, torn between the mountain and the woman who had been his whole life for more than 30 years. In the end, there had never really been a choice. He went to Margaret. Molly became one of the griefs he placed on a shelf because the larger grief had come roaring in behind it. Margaret declined quickly after that. Some days she knew exactly where she was. Other days she looked toward the den and asked if Molly had come back yet. Henry lied once. Only once. He told her maybe tomorrow. Margaret had closed her eyes and whispered, "Then leave the blanket there." A few months later, Margaret died before sunrise, with Henry holding her hand and the house so still it seemed afraid to breathe. After that, he stopped moving the blanket. Then he stopped entering the den. Then he stopped answering calls unless he had to. Loneliness did not break down his door. It moved in politely, one quiet habit at a time, until he could no longer tell where grief ended and ordinary life began. Now, in the present, Henry stood beside the same north-facing window with Molly's tag in his palm and her child in his house. The young puppy had turned from the glass at last. She watched him silently, rainwater drying in uneven patches along her coat. Henry lowered himself into the chair by the hearth. His chest ached with a feeling too complicated to name: shame, wonder, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. "You came from her," he whispered. The puppy took one careful step toward him, then another. She lowered her head, not in submission, but as if placing a message at his feet. Henry looked at the old tag again. Molly. The name that had vanished into snow had returned covered in mud, standing on 4 trembling legs, staring at him with Margaret's unfinished word written all over her face. The rain had not stopped by morning. It had only grown colder, sliding down the windows in silver threads while the Blue Ridge Mountains disappeared behind a wall of fog. Henry Walker sat at the kitchen table with Molly's old tag lying beside his untouched coffee. The German shepherd puppy stood near the north-facing window, her muddy coat now mostly dry, her torn ear tipped forward, her thin body trembling less from cold than from a nervous energy she could not explain. She had slept no more than an hour. Each time Henry thought she had finally given in, she rose again, crossed the hardwood floor, and returned to the glass. North. Always north. The mountains had swallowed Molly once. Now Molly's child was staring at them as if something inside that gray wilderness was calling her by name. Henry tried to be reasonable. Reason had kept him alive in war zones, in storms, in hospital corridors where doctors spoke in careful sentences. He told himself the puppy had followed a scent, wandered too far, found shelter by accident. Dogs did strange things. Grief did stranger things. But when he picked up the phone to call the county animal shelter, the puppy turned from the window and looked at him with such sharp attention that his thumb froze above the screen. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered. "I'm trying to do the responsible thing." The puppy crossed the room slowly and placed one paw on the toe of his boot. Not playful, not demanding, just there. Henry looked down at her scraped paw, at the dirt still packed between the pads, at the stubborn little body that had somehow reached his porch through rain and cold. "You got no idea how much trouble you are," he said. The puppy blinked, as if trouble were a language she had already learned. By mid-morning, Henry had decided he would drive her into town. That was safe. That was sensible. Someone there could scan for a chip, check her injuries, maybe find out where she had come from. He took his old field jacket from the hook beside the door. The moment he lifted it, the puppy stiffened. Then she stepped forward, caught the cuff gently between her teeth, and tugged. Henry looked at her. No. She tugged once more, softer this time, and released the fabric. Then she walked to the front door and looked back toward him. There was no excitement in her face, no wagging tail, no puppyish bouncing. Only urgency, quiet and painful. Henry's eyes drifted to the small basket near the hallway bench. Margaret's things were supposed to have been packed away, yet a cream-colored wool scarf still lay there, folded the way she had always folded it, neat as a prayer. The puppy approached the basket, lowered her head, and rested her chin against the scarf. Henry felt the room tilt inside him. Margaret's voice rose from memory, gentle but certain. "Sometimes animals don't find us because they're lost, Henry. Sometimes they find us because we are." She had said that the week Molly came into their home, smiling as if she knew something he was too stubborn to understand. Henry closed his eyes. For months after Margaret died, he had mistaken silence for peace. He had called it discipline, privacy, getting by. But maybe it had only been a locked door, and now a mud-covered puppy was scratching at it. "All right," he whispered, "but if this is some wild goose chase, I'm blaming your mother." The puppy lifted her head at the word mother. Henry noticed. He did not like that he noticed. He packed like the man he used to be. Flashlight, first aid kit, wool blanket, bottled water, rope, an old compass, dog food in a plastic container, and the emergency radio he had not touched in years. The pickup waited beneath the bare branches of the front oak, its dark green paint dulled by age and mountain weather. Henry opened the passenger door, expecting to lift the puppy in, but she climbed up on her own with awkward determination, her paws slipping once before she pulled herself onto the seat. She sat upright, facing the windshield, as if she had ridden beside him all her life. The road out of Boone was slick with rain. Fog moved low across the asphalt, curling between fence posts and bare trees. Henry drove slowly at first, following the route toward town because he still intended, in some tired corner of his mind, to do the sensible thing. But at the first fork, the puppy rose and pressed her nose toward the left road, the one that climbed away from town and into the foothills. Henry kept straight. The puppy whined once. Not loudly, not like an animal complaining, more like a small bell struck in a church no one visited anymore. Henry's hands tightened on the wheel. "You're not making this easy." At the next turnout, he stopped, sat there with the engine rumbling, then turned the truck around. The puppy settled again. They climbed into the Blue Ridge under a sky the color of old pewter. The road narrowed, then bent through wet pine forest and rocky cuts where water spilled in thin streams across the pavement. Henry watched the puppy from the corner of his eye. She did not behave like a dog enjoying a ride. She worked. Every few miles, she stood with her front paws against the dashboard, sniffing at the vents, then fixed her gaze on a direction until Henry followed. At one gravel road, she gave no sign, so he passed it. At the next, she scratched lightly at the door. Henry turned there. The road became rougher, patched with mud and fallen leaves. "You better know something I don't," he said. Near a small mountain store, Henry stopped for gas. The place looked half asleep, with a rusted ice machine outside and a porch roof sagging under rainwater. A woman named Carol Whitman stood behind the counter when Henry went in to pay. She was in her late 60s, round-faced and short, with copper-red hair faded almost orange, pale skin freckled by decades of Carolina sun, and the brisk, no-nonsense manner of someone who had survived 3 husbands, 2 floods, and 1 bad business partner without losing her ability to gossip. "Roads up past Alder Creek are turning nasty," she warned, eyeing Henry's wet jacket. "You heading that way?" Henry glanced through the window. The puppy was standing on the passenger seat, staring north through the glass. "Maybe." Carol followed his gaze and softened. "Pretty shepherd. Young one, too. Looks like she's got a mission." Henry gave a dry laugh. "Everybody keeps saying that." Carol handed him the receipt. Then, maybe listen. Back in the truck, those words stayed with him more than he wanted. Maybe listen. He had spent much of his life giving orders or obeying them. Listening was harder. Listening meant admitting that the world might still be speaking after the person whose voice mattered most was gone. The higher they climbed, the colder the rain became. It ticked against the windshield, then thickened into wet flakes that vanished as soon as they touched the glass. Henry's bad knee ached from holding the pedal steady. The puppy grew more alert, not less. At a bend where the main road continued east, she suddenly stood, ears forward, whole body rigid. A narrow dirt track ran north between two leaning posts nearly swallowed by vines. Henry slowed. That? The puppy gave a low sound from deep in her chest, not quite a bark, not quite a plea. Henry turned. The track was worse than it looked. Mud pulled at the tires. Branches scraped both sides of the truck. Twice Henry had to stop and clear fallen limbs. Each time, the puppy waited, eyes fixed ahead, shivering now, but refusing to lie down. The forest thickened until the world behind them seemed to close like a door. Henry felt old instincts waking in him. Measure distance, watch the slope, listen for water, know when the weather is lying. Snow began falling in earnest, soft at first, then heavier, dusting the hood and whitening the dead weeds along the road. Then the puppy changed. She rose suddenly, tail stiff, nose lifted. The exhaustion vanished from her face. Henry barely had time to brake before she pawed at the door handle. "Hold on," he barked, but she was already pushing against him. He parked beside a broken fence and stepped out into the cold. The puppy jumped down, stumbled once, recovered, and ran. "Hey!" Henry shouted. She did not look back. He grabbed the flashlight and followed as fast as his 73-year-old legs allowed. The puppy crossed a field of knee-high brown grass, heading toward a cluster of dark shapes at the base of the mountain. As Henry drew closer, the shapes became buildings. A collapsed shed, a rusted tractor, and beyond them an old farmhouse with its porch sunken on one side. The place had been abandoned for years. Windows stared black and empty. Vines climbed the walls like fingers. At the edge of the property stood a weathered barn, its roof bowed under age and fresh snow. The puppy stopped only once, at the open mouth of the barn. She turned to Henry, her eyes bright, desperate, and afraid. Then she slipped inside. Henry stood in the falling snow, breathing hard, staring at the dark doorway. The mountains were silent around him. Too silent. He lifted the flashlight, took one step toward the barn, and felt the old tag in his pocket press cold against his leg like a warning. Henry followed the puppy into the barn. The doorway yawned before him like the mouth of some forgotten beast. Black, damp, and breathing out the smell of wet wood, old hay, rusted metal, and years of abandonment. His flashlight beam shook more than he wanted to admit. At 73, Henry Walker still carried himself like a man built from oak and discipline. But age had found its way into his knees, grief had found its way into his ribs, and now fear had found its way into his hands. The puppy had vanished into the darkness ahead of him. He could hear her claws clicking against the warped boards, then stopping, then a soft, frantic whine that seemed to pull the air out of his lungs. "Easy," Henry called, though he was not sure whether he meant it for her or for himself. "I'm coming." The inside of the barn was worse than it had looked from outside. Half the roof sagged under the weight of fresh snow, and thin streams of water slipped through broken shingles, dripping into black puddles along the floor. Old tools hung from nails like relics left by people who had walked away in a hurry and never returned. A rusted feed trough leaned against one wall. A coil of rope lay stiff and gray near a cracked support beam. The place had the sorrow of a church after the candles had gone out, still standing, still shaped for shelter, but long past believing anyone would come. Henry moved carefully, testing each step before giving it weight. The puppy whimpered again, deeper inside, and this time Henry heard something beneath it. Breathing. Not the quick panting of the young shepherd. Not wind moving through the boards. This was slower, thinner, dragged from the bottom of a tired chest. Henry froze. For a heartbeat, he was back in another storm, another winter, kneeling beside a ditch while a pregnant German shepherd decided whether to trust his hand. The flashlight beam slipped across scattered hay, broken boards, a collapsed stall door, then landed on a corner near the rear wall. There, on a flattened bed of old straw, lay Molly. Henry did not speak at first. He could not. The name had lived in his guilt for so many months that seeing the body belonging to it felt almost impossible. Molly had changed so much that a careless man might not have known her. She had been strong once, even wounded, with a deep chest, thick black and tan coat, and amber-brown eyes bright with fierce suspicion. Now her body looked painfully thin beneath patches of dull fur. Gray had spread across her muzzle and around her eyes. One ear drooped where it had once stood alert. Her ribs rose and fell with visible effort, each breath a small battle against a body that had carried too much for too long. Yet even ruined by hunger, weather, motherhood, and time, something noble remained in her. She looked less like a stray dying in a barn than an old queen who had guarded the last gate until her strength failed. The puppy was pressed against Molly's side, licking her face with desperate little movements. Her thin tail trembled. She made no attempt to run to Henry now, no attempt to ask for food or warmth. Whatever mission had driven her across miles of cold road had ended in this corner. She had delivered him. The rest belonged to the old dog lying on the straw. Henry took one step forward, and Molly's eyes shifted toward him. At first they seemed cloudy, lost behind pain and exhaustion. Then recognition moved through them like the first flame under ash. "Molly," Henry whispered. The old German shepherd lifted her head a fraction of an inch. It cost her. Henry saw that immediately. Her neck trembled, her jaw tightened, and the breath that followed came rough, but she lifted it anyway. Her eyes stayed on him, and in that look Henry saw no confusion, no accusation, no fear. She knew him. After the snow, after the months, after the road that had taken her from his home and hidden her in the bones of this abandoned place, Molly knew him. Henry went down on one knee. Pain shot through his leg, sharp enough to make him wince, but he barely felt it. The puppy glanced at him, then pushed her nose under Molly's chin, as if encouraging her mother to hold on just a little longer. Henry reached out slowly, the same way he had in the snowbank less than a year before. "You stubborn girl," he said, his voice breaking in the middle. "What did you do?" Molly's nose touched his fingers. That small contact undid him more completely than a cry would have. Henry bowed his head. He had carried guilt like a stone for months, telling himself he should have searched longer, driven farther, ignored the doctor's call, found some impossible way to be in two places at once. He had imagined Molly dying alone in the storm. He had imagined her angry. He had imagined, in the cruelest hours after Margaret's death, that everything he loved either left him or was taken because he had failed to hold it tightly enough. But Molly's touch held none of that. It was not forgiveness because there had been no judgment. It was recognition. It was trust. It was the old bond returning without demanding an apology first. The puppy tucked herself closer to Molly, and Henry looked at her more carefully than he had before. In the dim light, the resemblance became almost painful. She had Molly's eyes, the same amber-brown gaze, though younger, clearer, still holding the wild brightness of a creature who had survived too early. Her paws were too large for her thin legs. Her ribs showed faintly beneath her coat. A young dog, yes, but still a puppy in the way hardship had failed to erase her softness, a child forced to become a messenger. Margaret's word rose in Henry's mind like a bell from another room. Hope. He did not say it aloud yet, not fully. The name felt too sacred to spend carelessly in a rotten barn, but it settled around the puppy all the same. Henry swept the flashlight around the stall. There were signs of a life Molly had carved out here with more courage than sense. A shallow hollow in the straw where she had nursed her pup. Scraps of old feed sacks dragged together to block the wind. A dented metal bowl, empty but clean from repeated licking. Near the wall lay the remains of something Henry did not look at for long. Tiny bones, almost hidden under hay, too small and too still. His throat tightened. Molly had not simply given birth here, she had fought here. She had tried to keep more than one alive. In the end, only this one had made it far enough to reach his porch. The truth came together slowly, each piece hurting as it found its place. Molly had not left because she forgot him. She had not vanished out of ingratitude or wildness. She had been a pregnant mother obeying some ancient pull, older than houses and human promises. Perhaps this barn had been familiar from before. Perhaps the storm had confused her. Perhaps pain and instinct had dragged her toward the one place she believed she could deliver safely. Whatever the reason, she had survived long enough to give birth, long enough to feed the last living pup, long enough to send that pup down from the mountain wearing the only name that might bring Henry back, the only name he could not ignore. Outside, the snowfall thickened, tapping softly against the broken roof. Molly's breathing rasped, then steadied when Henry laid his hand against her shoulder. Her fur was cold, too cold. "I should have found you," he said. The words were quiet, but they filled the stall. "I should have kept looking." Molly blinked slowly. The puppy leaned across her mother's neck and licked Henry's wrist, a tiny, clumsy gesture that felt almost like interruption. Henry gave a broken laugh through the tears he had not meant to shed. "All right," he murmured. "Maybe you two are done listening to an old fool confess." He opened the wool blanket he had brought from the truck and eased it around Molly's body. She made a faint sound. Not pain exactly, but exhaustion. The puppy watched every movement with anxious attention, her small muscles tight, ready to defend, ready to trust, unsure which one the moment required. Henry kept his voice low. "I'm going to get you out of here," he told Molly. "Both of you." But, as he said it, some part of him already understood what his heart refused to accept. Molly had waited for him, yes. She had remembered him, yes. But she had not called him back for rescue in the way he wanted. Her body was too thin, her breathing too shallow, her eyes too calm with the terrible wisdom of animals near the end. She had sent her pup because she could not make the journey herself. She had held the line until Henry arrived. The puppy pressed her face into Molly's neck, and Molly, with painful effort, shifted her head just enough to touch the young dog's crown. It was barely a movement. Still, it said everything. Henry watched them and felt the old barn blur before him. A mother, a child, a message carried through mud, rain, hunger, and mountain fog. Not abandoned, not forgotten, sent. Henry slid one arm carefully beneath Molly's chest and the other under her hips, preparing to lift her with the blanket. She was lighter than she should have been, heartbreakingly light, as if the mountain had taken pieces of her one winter night at a time. The puppy stood immediately, pressing close to Henry's leg, ready to follow. At the barn door, Henry paused and looked back at the dark corner where Molly had kept her final watch. He understood now. The puppy had not come to his porch because she needed a home. She had come because Molly, dying in the cold, had remembered the one man she believed would answer. And Henry, at last, had. Henry carried Molly out of the barn wrapped in the wool blanket, and the snow followed them like a quiet procession. The old German shepherd weighed almost nothing in his arms, far less than memory insisted she should. Hope pressed against his leg the entire way, stumbling through the wet grass, refusing to be more than a few inches from her mother. The abandoned farm behind them looked smaller now, swallowed by fog and snow, but Henry felt as if he were leaving a battlefield where no one had fired a shot and still, somehow, everything had been lost. He laid Molly across the back seat of the pickup, tucking the blanket around her thin body with a gentleness that surprised even him. Hope climbed in beside her without being told, circling once before curling near Molly's chest. For a moment, the young puppy rested her head against her mother's ribs, listening. Henry stood with one hand on the open door, watching them through the curtain of falling snow. "Hold on, girl," he said, though he knew enough about life, death, and exhausted bodies to recognize when hope had become more prayer than plan. The nearest veterinary clinic sat nearly 30 miles down the mountain, outside a small crossroads town called Alder Creek. The drive felt longer than any deployment Henry had survived. Mud pulled at the tires. Snow softened the edges of the road until the ditches disappeared beneath white. Several times Molly's breathing changed, becoming so faint that Henry looked sharply into the rearview mirror, expecting the worst. Each time, Hope lifted her head and touched her nose to Molly's muzzle, and each time Molly seemed to find one more breath. Henry drove with both hands locked on the wheel, his jaw tight beneath his white beard. He had spent decades believing control was a virtue. Secure the route, assess the risk, make the decision, move. But age had taught him the truth in crueler ways. Some doors could not be breached, some wounds could not be packed, some lives could not be ordered to stay. Margaret had taught him that from a hospital bed. Molly was teaching him again from the back seat of an old truck. Alder Creek Veterinary Clinic was a low brick building with green shutters, flower boxes gone brown from winter, and a hand-painted wooden sign swinging beside the entrance. A bell rang when Henry pushed through the door carrying Molly. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic, dog biscuits, and old coffee. A receptionist stood up quickly, but before she could speak, an older woman emerged from the hallway with a stethoscope around her neck. This was Dr. Susan Miller, though Henry did not know her name yet. She looked to be in her early 60s, medium height, with warm brown skin, short silver hair cut neatly around her ears, and dark eyes that had learned how to be honest without becoming cruel. Her face carried the calm of someone who had spent years standing beside people at both the happiest and hardest moments of loving animals. She wore no bright cheerfulness, no false comfort, only steadiness. Henry liked her immediately because she did not waste time pretending this was ordinary. "Bring her back here," she said softly, careful with her chest. The examination room was bright and clean, too clean for the mountain mud on Henry's boots and the grief already gathering in the corners. Dr. Miller worked with quiet precision. She checked Molly's gums, listened to her heart, ran careful hands along the old dog's ribs and belly, and examined the swollen joints, the shallow breathing, the dull coat, the signs of a body that had spent too long burning itself to keep another life warm. Hope sat under the exam table, trembling, her amber eyes following every movement. When a technician tried to lead her away, Hope gave a low sound, not a threat, but a refusal. Henry shook his head. "Let her stay." Dr. Miller glanced at the puppy, then at Molly, and nodded. "She's earned that." For nearly 20 minutes, the room held only small sounds: the click of instruments, the whisper of Molly's breath, the faint squeak of Henry's wet boots whenever he shifted his weight. At last, Dr. Miller removed the stethoscope from her ears and rested one hand on the table. Henry already knew. He had known in the barn. Still, knowing did not soften the blade when it came. "She's very weak," Dr. Miller said. "Severely underweight, dehydrated, her heart is failing, and her body is shutting down." Henry stared at Molly's face. The old dog's eyes were half open, fixed somewhere between him and Hope. "Can you help her?" he asked. Dr. Miller took a breath, not because she lacked the answer, but because she respected the weight of giving it. "I can make her comfortable. I can ease the pain. I can help her breathe a little easier for a while." Her voice gentled. "But I can't save her." The words settled into Henry's chest with the old familiar heaviness. Comfortable. A small word. A merciful word. A word that meant the war was already over. Hope crawled forward and placed one paw against the blanket hanging from the table. Molly's ear twitched faintly at the touch. Henry looked down at the puppy and suddenly understood why Molly had fought through the cold, why she had waited in that ruined barn, why she had sent her only surviving child down the mountain with an old tag around her neck. Molly had not been asking Henry to stop death. She had been asking him to be present when it came. Dr. Miller gave Molly medication to ease her pain and enough fluids to help her rest. When she finished, she looked at Henry with the kind of sorrow that did not intrude. Some people choose to say goodbye here, she said. Some choose home, if home is close enough and the animal is stable enough for the ride. Henry's hand closed gently over Molly's shoulder. Not here, he said. His voice was rough but certain. She waited in the mountains. I won't have her leave under fluorescent lights. Dr. Miller studied him, then nodded once. There's an old caretaker cabin near the Mercer property, about half a mile below that barn. If it's still standing, it would be warmer than the barn. Frank Mercer used to bring injured calves there during bad weather. Henry looked up at the name. Frank Mercer. He remembered it vaguely, a quiet old rancher with a weathered face and a habit of paying in cash. So Molly had not been entirely alone. That knowledge hurt and comforted him at once. Dr. Miller packed a small paper bag with medication instructions, then placed her hand briefly on Hope's head. This little one brought her to the right person, she said. Hope did not wag her tail. She only leaned into the touch for one tired second. By late afternoon, Henry found the cabin Dr. Miller had mentioned. It stood beyond the abandoned farmhouse, tucked near a line of pines where the wind broke before crossing the field. The roof sagged but held. The door stuck, then opened with a groan. Inside were a stone fireplace, a narrow cot, a rough wooden table, and enough dust to prove no one had expected visitors in years. Henry worked with the blunt efficiency of an old soldier given one final duty. He cleared the hearth, carried in dry wood from a covered stack behind the cabin, shook out an old canvas tarp, and laid his own blanket beside the fire. Hope followed every step, occasionally returning to Molly as if afraid her mother might disappear if not watched. When the fire finally caught, orange light filled the cabin and pushed the shadows back into the corners. Henry eased Molly onto the blanket near the hearth. Hope curled against her belly, no longer restless, only watchful. Night came quietly. Snow tapped at the small windows. The fire cracked and sighed. Henry sat on the floor beside Molly, his back against the wall, one hand resting near her shoulder. He spoke because silence had become too heavy and because Molly had already heard so much of his heart once before in Margaret's last winter. He told her Margaret was gone. He told her the house had become too large after the funeral, every room a shrine and every morning an argument with the empty chair across from him. He told her he was sorry. Sorry for not finding her. Sorry for stopping after 3 days. Sorry for choosing the hospital over the mountain even though no part of him truly regretted being beside his wife. I didn't know how to lose both of you, he whispered. So I buried one grief under the other and called it surviving. Hope lifted her head at the sound of his voice. Henry looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth Margaret would have seen immediately. The puppy was not only Molly's child, she was a message wrapped in fur and mud and stubbornness. A small, breathing command to come back to the world. Henry reached out and touched the young dog's head. Your mother crossed more miles than I understand to send you to me, he said, and I nearly handed you to a shelter before breakfast. A faint laugh broke through him, cracked and wet. Margaret would never let me hear the end of that. Near dawn, Molly opened her eyes. The fire had burned low, and the first pale light of morning pressed against the frosted window. Hope stirred immediately, rising on unsteady legs. Molly looked at her daughter for a long time. Then, with effort that seemed to gather from the last guarded room of her heart, she shifted her gaze to Henry. No bark, no whine. No miracle thundered through the cabin. Only a mother's eyes, tired beyond pain, giving away the last treasure she had kept safe. Henry understood. He placed his hand gently on Hope's head. The name Margaret had chosen came to him not like invention, but like something finally remembered. Hope, he whispered. The puppy leaned into his palm. Henry looked back at Molly. I'll take her home. Molly's breathing eased, as if the promise had reached the place words were meant to go. Her head settled near Henry's boot. Hope lowered herself beside her mother and pressed close. A few minutes later, Molly exhaled one last time, peaceful and without struggle, while the snow outside softened the whole mountain into silence. 2 days after Molly passed, the storm lifted from the Blue Ridge, leaving the valley washed in pale winter light and a silence so clean it almost hurt to breathe. Henry buried her beneath an old maple tree at the edge of the meadow, where the land sloped gently toward the abandoned farm and the mountains stood beyond it like ancient witnesses. The ground was hard from frost, and each strike of the shovel sent pain up through his shoulders, but Henry did not stop. At 73, his body complained often and loudly, yet some duties were too sacred to be handed to anyone else. He chose a place where morning light would find her first. He carved her name into a piece of weathered barnwood with the pocket knife he had carried since his Navy days, the same knife whose handle had been worn smooth by years of use and worry. Molly. No dates, no grand words, just the name. That felt right. Molly had never asked for much. Shelter, trust, a chance to protect what she loved. Hope sat beside the grave the entire time. The young German shepherd did not whine or paw at the dirt. She did not run toward the field or search the barn for a mother who would not rise. She only sat there, thin body still, torn ear angled toward the mound, amber-brown eyes fixed on the marker. Snow clung to the fur along her back. Henry watched her and felt something old shift in him. People often fought endings with noise. Dogs, sometimes, honored them with silence. When the burial was finished, Henry remained beneath the maple until his hands had gone numb inside his gloves. He wanted to say something noble, something Margaret would have approved of, but the words came out plain. "You did good, girl." Hope lowered her head, as if the sentence belonged to both of them. Henry knelt carefully and rested one hand on the puppy's back. Beneath the damp fur, he could feel the small rise and fall of life that Molly had guarded with the last of her strength. "Come on," he said at last. "Let's go home." The word home startled him. He had not used it honestly in months. The house in Boone had become a building full of boxes, a place he planned to surrender because staying had begun to feel like sleeping inside a memory. But Hope climbed into the truck as if she had always known where they were going, and Henry drove back down from the mountain with Molly's tag in his coat pocket and Margaret's chosen name riding beside him. The house looked unchanged when he returned. The front porch still sagged slightly near the left rail. The oak tree still leaned over the drive. Rainwater still gathered in the same cracked stone near the steps. Inside, the boxes remained where he had left them, half filled with Margaret's sweaters, books, gardening gloves, and the little ordinary objects that became holy after someone died. Yet Henry felt different crossing the threshold. Grief had not left him. It had simply moved, making room for something else. Hope entered slowly, nose low, taking in the smell of the house she had never known and somehow seemed to recognize. She passed the kitchen, the hallway, the fireplace, then stopped at the doorway of the back den. Henry followed and felt his throat close. The cream-colored blanket Margaret had once prepared for Molly's unborn puppies still lay folded near the wall. He had not touched it since Molly disappeared. Dust softened its edges, but the fabric was still there, waiting with the patience of things left behind by love. Hope walked to it, circled twice, and lay down directly on top of it. Henry made a sound he did not recognize as his own. It was not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. It was the noise of a man whose heart had held too many locked rooms and suddenly found one door standing open. He lowered himself into the old chair beside the den window and covered his face with both hands. For months after Margaret died, he had believed crying was something that happened early, something a man did at funerals or hospital beds before getting on with the practical work of being alone. But tears, he discovered, were patient hunters. They waited in boxes, in blankets, in dog tags, in small paws stepping onto old promises. Hope lifted her head and watched him. Then she rose, crossed the room, and placed her chin on his knee with the same quiet seriousness Molly had once used beside Margaret's chair. Henry's hand fell to the young dog's head. "You really are your mother's daughter," he whispered. That evening, while looking for a towel to clean Hope's paws, Henry opened the wrong drawer in the sideboard and found the letter. It lay beneath a stack of unpaid donation requests and old insurance forms. Still sealed, the envelope softened at the corners from months of being moved aside but never opened. The handwriting made his stomach tighten. Emily. Emily Walker was Henry and Margaret's only child, 45 years old now, though in Henry's mind she still flickered between ages. 7, running barefoot through the yard with a jar full of lightning bugs. 16, tall and furious, slamming a car door because Henry had missed another school event. 32, holding Margaret's hand at a hospital appointment and pretending not to be afraid. In the present, Emily lived in Charlotte and worked as a middle school counselor. She was tall like Henry, but built with Margaret's grace, slender, long-limbed, with chestnut-brown hair she usually wore loose around her shoulders, warm olive skin from her mother's side of the family, and serious brown eyes that had learned too early how to hide disappointment behind patience. She had Margaret's tenderness, but Henry's stubborn spine. That combination had made her loving enough to keep calling and proud enough to stop begging. Henry sat at the kitchen table with the unopened letter in front of him for nearly 10 minutes. Hope lay beneath the table, her head resting on his boot. Finally, he slid one finger under the flap and opened it. The letter was 3 pages long. Emily did not accuse him. That made it worse. Anger would have been easier to resist. She wrote about her children, about work, about how the dogwood tree in her yard had bloomed early that spring. Then, gradually, the words lowered their guard. She wrote that she missed him. Not the Navy SEAL version other people admired, not the granite-faced man who said he was fine, but her father, the man who once taught her to change a tire in the rain and then bought her hot chocolate because she had cried from frustration. She wrote that after Margaret died, it felt as if the house in Boone had swallowed him whole. Near the end, one sentence struck so hard Henry had to put the paper down. After Mom died, it felt like I lost both of you. The kitchen blurred. Henry closed his eyes, but the words remained. He had told himself he was sparing Emily the weight of his grief. He had told himself she had her own life, her own family, her own burdens. He had told himself silence was a form of strength. But sitting there with hope pressed against his boot, he saw the truth plainly at last. He had not spared his daughter. He had abandoned her at the edge of the same grave where he buried his own heart. Molly had crossed snow, hunger, and failing strength to make sure her child was not left alone. Henry, who claimed to understand loyalty, had allowed his child to knock on a closed door for months. Hope stood, stretched stiffly, and rested her head on his knee again. The gesture was so gentle it felt like mercy. Henry picked up his phone from the table. Emily's number was still there, though he had ignored it so often it seemed almost ashamed to be remembered. His thumb hovered over the screen. Combat had never made his hand tremble like this. Neither had storms, surgeries, or the long walk behind Margaret's casket. This was a different battlefield, one without armor, rank, or orders. Just a father, a daughter, and all the words waiting between them like snow on an unmarked road. Henry pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He nearly ended it on the 4th. Then the line clicked open, and a woman's voice, older than the child in his memory but still carrying Margaret's softness, whispered, "Dad?" Henry closed his eyes. Hope leaned against his leg. For the first time in years, Henry did not hang up. The first real snow of the season came to Boone 3 weeks after Henry made the call, laying a soft white hush over the Blue Ridge and turning every pine branch into a silver brushstroke against the morning sky. Henry stood on the front porch with one hand wrapped around a mug of black coffee and the other resting on Hope's head. The young German shepherd had already grown stronger in those weeks. Her ribs no longer showed as sharply. Her black and tan coat had begun to shine beneath daily brushing, and the torn tip of one ear gave her a permanently curious look, as if the world kept telling secrets just to her. She still followed Henry from room to room, not nervously now, but with the steady devotion of a creature who had chosen her post. Some mornings he would find her sleeping beside the back den where Margaret's cream-colored blanket still lay. Some nights she would rise suddenly and stare toward the mountains, not with urgency anymore, but with remembrance. Henry understood that. He had been doing the same thing for years. A dark blue SUV appeared at the end of the driveway just after noon, its tires crunching slowly over the snow. Henry's hand tightened around the porch rail. He had faced armed men in foreign alleys, crossed black water under moonless skies, and once stitched his own arm in a tent while mortar fire walked closer by the minute. None of that had made his heart behave the way it did now. Emily stepped out of the driver's seat and stood beside the open door for a moment, looking up at the house where she had grown up and away from which she had spent too many years protecting herself. She was 45, tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair falling past her shoulders and warm olive skin made paler by winter light. Her brown eyes were Margaret's eyes when they were gentle, Henry's when they were hurt. Time had placed fine lines at their corners, not from age alone, but from years of being the daughter who kept calling a father who rarely answered. She wore a gray wool coat, dark jeans, and the careful expression of someone approaching a bridge that had collapsed once and might still hold if no one stepped too hard. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Emily closed the car door. "Hi, Dad," she said. Henry nodded once, too stiffly. "Hi, Em." The old nickname slipped out before he could stop it. Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or relief. The porch between them felt enormous, though it was only 6 steps. Henry wanted to apologize properly, but all the words lined up like soldiers refusing to march. Emily looked at the boxes still visible through the front window. "You still packing?" she asked. Henry followed her gaze. "I was." "Was?" He opened his mouth, but hope chose that moment to save both of them from honesty arriving too naked. She bounded down the steps in a flurry of snow, circled Emily once, sniffed her boots, then pressed her head into Emily's gloved hand with such solemn certainty that Emily's face broke. She crouched in the snow and laughed, though tears came with it. "Oh," she whispered, stroking Hope's ears, "you must be the little miracle causing all this trouble." Henry cleared his throat. "She's got a talent for it." Hope wagged her tail exactly once, as if accepting the compliment with military restraint. Inside, the house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the chicken stew Henry had nearly burned because he kept checking the driveway. Emily noticed, but did not tease him right away, which meant she noticed too much. They sat in the living room at first, separated by the coffee table and a decade of unsaid things. Conversation began carefully. Her drive from Charlotte, the snow, her work at the school, his bad knee. Safe subjects, small subjects, little stepping stones across a river neither of them wanted to fall into. Hope lay between them on the rug, her head shifting from one voice to the other. Finally, Emily looked toward the framed photograph on the mantel. Margaret, sitting in the summer light, one hand raised as if scolding Henry for taking the picture. Beside it now lay Molly's tag. Emily stood slowly and picked it up. "This was hers?" Henry nodded. "Molly's." Emily turned the metal disc over in her palm. "Tell me everything." So he did. He told her about the storm, about finding Molly pregnant in the ditch, about Margaret warming towels with hands that shook but never stopped trying. He told her about the cream-colored blanket, the name Hope, the night Molly vanished, and the days he searched until the snow erased every answer. He told her what he had never admitted, that when Margaret got worse, he chose the hospital and had carried guilt for that choice ever since, even though he would make the same choice again because love sometimes tore a man in two and still demanded he walk. Emily listened without interrupting. Once she wiped her cheek with her sleeve. Once she laughed softly when Henry admitted Margaret had called him a guilty schoolboy for bringing home a pregnant dog. Then he told her about Hope on the porch, the road into the mountains, the ruined barn, Molly's eyes recognizing him, and the cabin where Molly gave him her last trust. By the end, Henry's voice had gone rough. She looked at Hope. he said, staring into the fire, then at me, like she was asking me to do what I failed to do before. Emily shook her head gently. Maybe she was telling you that you hadn't failed. Henry looked at her then. She had Margaret's mercy, but it did not come soft enough to let him hide. Dad, you came back when it mattered. The words settled between them like snow finding the ground. That evening, Emily wandered into the kitchen while Henry rinsed bowls at the sink. She opened a cabinet and paused. Dad? What? Why do you have 6 cans of green beans and no actual food? Henry glanced over. Green beans are food? They are an ingredient in food. That sounds like counselor talk. She gave him a look so much like Margaret's that he almost dropped the dish. Then she smiled. Not fully, not as if nothing had happened, but enough for the room to remember what laughter sounded like. Hope trotted in carrying one of Henry's socks like a captured enemy. Emily bent over laughing, and Henry, against all expectation, laughed too. The sound startled him. It had been rusty at first, then real. Hope pranced as if she had personally restored civilization. Before Emily left that night, she stood with Henry on the porch while snow fell beyond the yellow circle of the porch light. "Are you still selling the house?" she asked. Henry looked through the window at Hope curled on Margaret's blanket, at the boxes he had no desire to finish, at the walls that had held grief but had also held love. A month ago, the answer had been practical. Now practicality felt like surrender, dressed in clean clothes. "No," he said. Emily turned toward him. "No?" Henry shook his head. "I'm staying." Relief moved across her face so openly it humbled him. "I hoped you would." He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the child he had lost track of, but the woman who had waited longer than he deserved. "Come for Christmas," he said. "Bring the kids." Emily's mouth trembled. "They've been asking about you." The sentence hurt, but it did not destroy him. Hope barked once from inside, sharp and badly timed, as if voting yes. Emily laughed through fresh tears. "Then we'll come." Christmas arrived with noise Henry had forgotten houses could hold. Emily returned with her 2 children, Noah, 12, a lean boy with unruly dark hair, solemn gray-brown eyes, and the suspicious dignity of a child who wanted to be treated older than he was. And Lily, 8, small and bright-faced, with honey-brown curls, freckles across her nose, and a fearless tenderness toward every living thing she met. Noah tried to act calm when Hope greeted them. Lily made no such attempt. Within 5 minutes, both children were in the yard, chasing Hope through drifts of snow, while Emily stood beside Henry at the window. "She's good for them," Emily said. Henry watched Hope circle back to make sure Lily had not fallen too far behind. "She's good for me." Emily reached over and touched his arm. It was brief, but Henry felt the bridge hold. A year passed, not magically, but honestly. The house did not become happy all at once. It learned. Coffee brewed for visitors. Toys appeared in corners. Emily called every Sunday, and Henry answered, even when he had nothing important to say. Hope grew into a beautiful young shepherd with a broad chest, bright eyes, and the habit of sleeping across doorways like a furry security checkpoint. Henry started Molly's Hope Fund with a coffee can at Carol Whitman's Mountain Store, then a page in the church bulletin, then a county-wide network of food donations, foster homes, vet vouchers, and rides for elderly pet owners who could no longer drive. It was not grand. It was better than grand. It was useful. Dr. Miller helped. Carol talked everyone into helping whether they planned to or not. Emily handled the paperwork because Henry considered forms of personal insult from civilization. On the first anniversary of Molly's burial, Henry walked with Hope to the old maple tree above the valley. Snow had not come yet that year, and autumn leaves burned gold around them like small lanterns hung by invisible hands. Hope, stronger now and taller, lay beside his boots with her head on her paws, looking toward the mountains with peaceful eyes. Henry rested one hand on Molly's wooden marker. He had once believed the puppy came to his porch because she needed saving. Now he understood the deeper mercy. Molly had sent Hope home not to escape loneliness, but to end his. She had trusted him with her child, and in doing so had returned him to his own. Henry looked down at Hope and smiled, the kind of smile that no longer felt borrowed from the past. "You did good, Molly," he whispered. "You brought the house back." Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes God's mercy comes quietly, through a tired puppy on a porch, an old wound reopened, or a phone call we almost refused to make. Henry thought Hope came to his door because she needed saving, but the deeper truth was that his own heart had been waiting to be rescued. In our daily lives, we may also carry grief, regret, or loneliness so long that it begins to feel normal. Yet love still knows the road home. A small act of courage, a kind word, or one hand reaching out can become the beginning of healing. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Comment where you are watching from, subscribe for more heartfelt stories, and may God bless you, protect your loved ones, and fill your home with peace.